I am glad that you guys are here for the day that we're going to talk about just this completely non-controversial issue of human sexuality. It's such a boring topic, and there's no division in our society amongst these issues. No, look, we realize these are extremely sensitive issues, very divisive issues, and we wish to address these issues with humility, with kindness, and with love. But of course, there are many who would say what we have to say today is very unloving. And so I want to just give you some preliminary remarks to give some context to our whole day today. So I think we have to first think about what love is. What does that even mean? Because I love the Tar Heels. They didn't go as far as I wanted them to go. I love my wife. I love the pizza that's across the street. It's a really good place over there. I love working here, but I certainly don't love all those things in the same way, right? So what exactly does love mean? I want to show you a video some of you may have seen. It's a couple years old now that was put out by the Ad Council. So you helped pay for this, as a matter of fact. But just to give you an idea.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I really like, oh my God, look at the skeleton. It's beautiful.
My favorite part was when we put on sensors and went into the box so we could dance and it would be like our skeletons would be in the screen in the box.
Look at people react like so beautiful.
On Valentine's Day 2015, a group of families, couples, and friends took part in a unique event with a very simple message. Love has no gender, no race, no age, no disability, no labels.
Our nation was founded on a bedrock principle. We are all created equal. Progress on this journey often comes in small increments, propelled by the persistent effort of dedicated citizens.
I know that Valentine's Day is coming up and it's full of love and it has a beautiful message. But remember, love is an everyday and every minute thing. It's not just on Valentine's Day.
Love has no labels.
She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm.
This morning, the Supreme Court recognized that the Constitution guarantees marriage equality.
Are you telling me something?
Maybe, yeah.
It's really just about support, finding if you have one person who loves and supports you for who you are, then hold on to that person for dear life.
Nothing would stop me from loving you, my dear.
Love is what you make it, love is what you want it to be.
To me, love is blind.
Love is for everybody, no matter who it is.
They're no different than they were when they were younger.
I love you all for coming. It's made my day.
There are a lot of people in the world still struggling to have peace and love. That's why Love Has No Labels have to continue sending the same message to get to the lost person on earth, so they feel what we feel.
If we dare to peek behind the screen of our bias, we'll find that with love, we're all the same. We are all human. This Valentine's Day, share your story and show the world that love has no labels.
She keeps me warm. She keeps me warm. I'm not crying on Sunday.
I don't know if you could hear 1 Corinthians 13 being repeated in the background of that song. Pulls at your heartstrings a little bit, doesn't it? There's certainly some truth, some nuggets of truth in there. And this doesn't necessarily define love, but they certainly give you their idea of what love is not. And I agree that we are all human beings, which is exactly why we're discussing the topic that we're doing today. Why are we erasing human sexuality? And I phrase it that way for a very specific purpose that I think, or at least hope, will be more clear here in just a few minutes. Because I argue that if we define love as this anything goes, it has no labels, whatever you want it to be kind of way, we actually erase our humanity. We erase the very thing that makes us who we are. And just to give you the punchline, before I forget about the video. The only thing the video proves is that all human beings normally functioning have skeletons. That's the only thing that whole thing proves, honestly. But it certainly pulls at your heartstrings while I was making that point. So why do I think defining love in this way erases our humanity? Well, to answer that, we have to ask another question. And that is, what is love? What do we mean by love? So we could give all sorts of definitions, and of course our culture typically understands that in a very emotional, lovey-dovey kind of way. Sadly, the church does too. I have a pastor friend of mine up in the Greensboro area who plays a game with congregations he speaks in occasionally, and he'll play different songs, and they have to guess, is it a love song or is it a Christian song? Because you can't tell the difference oftentimes. Am I singing to God or to my sweetheart? You know, if I can fall in love, then I can fall out of love, right? And that's how our culture and sadly the church thinks about love. But classically understood, love means something very specific. It means to will the good of another and to desire the proper communion with the beloved. Friendship between just buddies, or whether it's loving properly our neighbor, whatever that looks like. And of course, loving God would be a very specific kind of love, but is willing the good of another. And we can do that regardless of our feelings. If any of you are married, I've been married 16 years this year, I think, and I'm sure I give my wife plenty of reasons not to feel like loving me, and did a good job of that last night, as a matter of fact. But we can choose to still will the good for the other, right? That is what love actually means. But of course, that raises yet another question. We actually are going to answer some questions here, but we have to answer these questions as we ask other ones down the pipe. So if we're willing the good of another, what in the world is the good? Because we use good much like we use the word love, right? Boy, that was a really good rainstorm a while ago. I had a good supper last night. I have 3 good boys at home. My car drove really good in the rain coming in this morning. Well, I certainly don't mean my boys are good in the same way that I mean my car drove good through the rain. So what does good actually mean in this sense? Excuse me. Well, once again, classically understood, good is that which fulfills the purpose or the end of something according to its nature, according to what it is. Let me say that again. So good is that which fulfills the end or the purpose of something according to its nature, or according to what that thing is. So if I say, to give you a couple of examples, if I say it's really good for that thing to be submersed in salt water 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's great, isn't it? What is that thing? Is it a baby? Or is it a baby shark? Sorry, I have a little one at home. Right? If it's a baby shark, then it's very good for it to be submerged in salt water, and it would be very bad if it weren't. If it's a human baby, not so much, right? Biology, I think, is the easiest place to see this. So think about an eye. If I said, or if I asked you, an eye that doesn't hear well, is that a good eye or a bad eye? An eye that doesn't hear well, good or bad? You don't know, right? It doesn't say you could be blind and your eye wouldn't hear well, right? So it doesn't tell you anything about your eye. Why? Because the eye is not the kind of thing that's directed towards hearing. It's the kind of thing directed towards seeing. Now, do we have anything to do with that? No. We discover that about ourselves, right? So it's completely objective. It doesn't matter how much I want my eyes to hear. They're just not that kind of thing. And so if I choose to violate that purpose and rip my eyes out because they don't hear, that would be a very bad thing, right? It would be acting contrary to the purpose of my eyes, right? So now, being blind isn't necessarily moral goodness or badness. So how does this relate to morality? So what we're doing here is called natural law. And not natural law in the sense of gravity or thermodynamics or any of those sorts of things. Natural law in the sense of what is good or bad for something according to its nature. according to to what it is, its essence. Use essence, nature, form. You may hear those words used interchangeably in this particular context. This goes back to Thomas Aquinas, which goes back to Aristotle, and even before that. You may hear some references to this in the Declaration of Independence, for example. Martin Luther King's letters from a Birmingham jail. It says an unjust law is no law at all if it violates the natural law. Human law is a specific instance of carrying out what is good for us according to natural law. So why do we have speed limits? Was there anything violating our human nature if we go more than 60 miles an hour? Well, no. But it is violating our human nature if we're reckless and we kill someone. So it's a very specific way that we can help human beings, which are social by nature, live in community with one another and not act recklessly, right? So natural law in this sense is how we tie this goal-directedness that we've seen in eyes and ears and all that to morality. So reason tells us what is actually good for us because we know the ends of things according to what those things are because we're able to know things about reality. And so the moral person, or we could say the reasonable person, pursues what is actually good for them, even if that's opposed to their feelings. And so sin, in this sense, is actually seeking something that could be good in and of itself, but seeking it in the wrong way. And so let's take sexuality, for instance. The sexual union is a very good thing. The sexual part of our natures are very good things. But if we use those things in a way that is contrary to the purposes towards which those things are directed, that just is what we mean by bad or immoral. And so does that mean, for instance, if my lungs are for taking in oxygen and oxygenating my blood, right? That would certainly mean sniffing paint thinner all day would be a bad thing for you to do. Regardless of whether you hurt anyone, or regardless of whether you want to do it, regardless if you have a genetic disposition towards wanting to sniff paint thinner, if that were such a thing. It wouldn't mean it's good for you any more than being born blind means you have good eyes. There's something wrong. You shouldn't do that. But that doesn't mean I can't blow up a balloon. Right now, if all I did all day long was blow up balloons and use my lungs for that instead of oxygenating my blood, well, then that doesn't last very long, right? You get lightheaded and you faint. If you've ever tried to blow up one of those really big balloons. Again, I have little boys. This happens. I haven't fainted yet, though. Likewise, with our sexuality, some people may want to say, well, so I'm just using my sexual faculties in a different way. Big whoop. Well, no, you're using them in a way contrary to. Blowing up a balloon is not contrary to the purpose of my lungs. It's something I can do in addition to that. But using my sexual faculties in a way that is directed towards the opposite ends that they're actually used for is completely contrary to the good of those faculties. So same-sex union, same-sex marriage, I would say even transgenderism, being someone we're not by nature, all of those things, that is why, from a natural law standpoint, we would say those things are necessarily bad, regardless of why someone has those inclinations, regardless of what someone thinks about it. Again, this is an objective standard that we're appealing to, our human nature. We find that about ourselves. We discover that about ourselves. We don't make that up. And so when someone says, well, I was born that way. Okay, well, I'm going to have even more compassion for you if that is actually the case, which there's no scientific evidence for. But if you think that's the case, I'm going to have even more compassion for you than I should have already. But it doesn't mean that it's good for you to act on that. Again, any more than being born blind means your eyes are fine. No, it means something's wrong with your eyes. We have to adapt to overcome that. And so the compassionate thing to do would be to help someone come back to functioning in the way that their human nature is directed towards. So we've done all of this, again, scratching the surface here, obviously, but we've done all of this without quoting a single verse of Scripture. And what I like about this is twofold. One, It gives us common ground from which we're able to dialogue about these things, much like we do any of our apologetics here at SES anyway, arguing for the existence of God or the reliability of the Scriptures, the existence of truth, knowability of truth, whatever the case may be. We can look at reality, the reality in which we all live, and have common ground from which we can have conversations with unbelievers. But also, I find this fascinating, and just a quick story, side note, I got into this whole natural law way of thinking while I was a student here, but out of necessity. I was doing campus ministry at UNC Greensboro, and this was 2010, 11, whenever Amendment 1 was going on in North Carolina, if you guys remember the whole Amendment 1 thing. And ironically enough, it was my friends in the Atheist and Agnostic and Skeptic Club that wanted me to sign their petition against Amendment 1. And because it was, just immoral to not provide marriage, quote unquote, equality and all of this sort of stuff. And really all I had to say was, that's not right. I think marriage is this, man and woman and all this, but I really don't have any answers for you other than an ick factor, for me personally, which is not an answer, and some Bible verses. But they're atheists, so what do they care? Might as well quote the Quran or the Book of Mormon or whatever. The fairy tales would be as authoritative in their lives, right? So I had to really start digging and took some classes here and really started digging into the philosophy behind this and just found natural law fascinating. And it gives us this common ground, but what is awesome for me at least is it kind of peels away those layers and helps you get behind the curtain just a bit to see why God says what He does about human sexuality. Not because He just has some weird fascination with our sex lives, or He's just a big, mean old dad in the sky waiting to bonk you on the head when you do wrong and He wants to make your life difficult and all that sort of thing. No. He's the author of our nature. He sets the ends towards which we're directed as the author and sustainer of our very existence, with sustaining and creating what we are. And because He is perfectly good, He can only ever will what is good for us. And if the good is that towards which we're directed according to our natures, He'll never will what is contrary to our natures. And so it's for our good that He commands these things, not because He gets some fascination or pleasure out of making our lives miserable. So it really gives you a much deeper understanding of just morality as a whole. And honestly, this is a good argument for the existence of God we don't have time to get into today. So it kind of moves you beyond the, because I'm dad and I said so. Right? I mean, I have to give that answer sometimes because I don't feel like explaining in your 5, so be quiet. I don't have to give you an explanation. Just do it. But that's only satisfying for so long, right? Eventually you grow up and you need to know. And this really, I think, helps get behind that. And so I just wanted to offer just a few thoughts about this to set the context for the rest of what we'll be discussing today. So when we ignore our human nature, and our human nature just is what we are, well, if we ignore that, then we essentially just become animals. It's our rationality that sets us apart from the animals. And when we want to just erase that, then we literally are acting like animals. And we see that, sadly, in our culture. And so if love is to will the good of another, and I'm convinced that this is your good, for me not to will that for you, that's not love. That would be annihilate. My willing your annihilation, my willing you to be something you're not. That's the epitome of hate. And so you get questions sometimes of, I have a transgender friend who actually have had this happen on Facebook, and actually this person wasn't transgender. They were determining themselves to be asexual. And so they created a new Facebook profile, and if you want to be my friend, you have to use these certain pronouns and this, that, and the other. Well, in order to not, this is my answer for this, okay? I'm not saying this applies to everyone necessarily, but I wasn't going to violate my conscience and feed what I consider to be a delusion in them by abiding by their rules. So I referred to them, had this long Facebook conversation without ever using he or she or any of the pronouns they wanted to use. I just phrased my sentences in such a way that I didn't have to use any of those words. But guess what they did? They unfriended me. But I didn't violate any of your rules, and I didn't violate my conscience at the same time. So I was respecting what you want, but also not violating me in an effort to hopefully still be your friend because I love you, because I will your good. But that still wasn't good enough. And that's just a matter of the will at that point. That's not a matter of they don't have enough good arguments or whatever the case may be. So let me end just with a word of caution. Our society is so far removed from being able to think rationally about these things that if you find someone who's willing to actually have a dialogue, and they're out there, it happens, it's not going to be an overnight process unless God just does a miracle, right? It's going to be a long, drawn-out relationship kind of process where you're working through these things, more than likely. Dr. Land can speak more to this because he's the expert on this, but I'm leaning more and more, I guess now that I have a almost 9 and almost 6 and almost 3-year-old, to not worrying about those who are so lost in the delusion that I just can't reason with them. But I can equip the next generation so that they can think well about what they're experiencing right now. I mean, my kids love watching American Idol because we like music. And they can't even watch American Idol without me having to explain why these two guys keep talking about their boyfriends. And I'm trying to figure out how to do that, or just fast forward it or something. That's just what's going on in my house. But I can, as they get older, equip them to think well. So hopefully we can stem the tide of the irrationality. But as Ed Feser, one of my favorite philosophers, puts it, I'm going to read it from this screen because it's too small on mine. And if seeking what is bad for us has a tendency to impair one's capacity to perceive what is true and good, especially where sex is concerned, then it follows that widespread rejection of traditional sexual morality is bound to have as much to do with the sort of cognitive corruption that Aquinas calls blindness of mind as it does with the making of honest intellectual mistakes. That people who don't behave in accordance with traditional sexual moral norms also don't believe that these norms have any solid intellectual foundation is thus in no way surprising. So we are dealing with blindness of mind in our culture. Not that these people are irrational, because they're still human beings. They still have a rational nature. But they have become oftentimes so deluded that the ability to think rationally at any given time about any given subject can be very, very difficult. So this requires true love on our parts, compassion, grace, respect, patience, and gentleness. This is not something we beat over the head of people. This is not something, like I said, that just happens quickly in one conversation and boom, on to the next person. This is a very difficult subject with which to deal. And we certainly have plenty of job security if you are into studying morality and natural law and those sorts of things. So what we are called to is to engage in this spiritual warfare, realizing that those that we're combating are not the enemy. Right, 2 Timothy 2, 24 through 26. We're on a search and rescue mission to save those who have been captured by the enemy and held captive to do his will. But as 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5 say, we're to demolish arguments and every high-minded thing raised up against the knowledge of God, taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. How do you demolish bad arguments? With good arguments, right? Not sometimes with a Bible verse, if the context calls for it. If that's all you got to share, by all means, share it. His word does not return void. But that is not the only tool at our disposal. We have this thing called reality, in which we all live. And you can only fight reality so long before reality has a way of fighting back. And again, this reality gives us this common ground from which we can engage these subjects and other similar subjects in loving, relational conversations with our friends and family and coworkers and whoever that may be.